The morning sun blazed over Atlanta with the ferocity of a furnace, casting harsh shadows across Centennial Olympic Park and turning the concrete walkways into radiating plates of heat. Lieutenant Sarah Collins adjusted her tactical sunglasses and scanned the growing crowd, her hand resting loosely on the lead connected to Max, who stood alert beside her, his dark eyes surveying the scene with predatory focus. The Belgian Malinois had been unusually restless since they arrived at 0600, his ears rotating like satellite dishes, picking up signals only he could interpret. The charity event had drawn thousands of spectators, a sea of faces gathered around temporary stages, food vendors, and sponsor booths that transformed the park into a festival of corporate philanthropy. Politicians in expensive suits shook hands with celebrities who smiled for photographers, while children clutched balloons and parents applied sunscreen with the urgency of people who had underestimated the Georgia heat. Security was visible everywhere, uniformed officers stationed at choke points, plainclothes detectives weaving through the crowd, and 3 K-9 units conducting sweeps of the perimeter. Sarah had been assigned primary coverage of the main stage, where in less than an hour the mayor would deliver remarks alongside the CEO of Hammond Industries, the tech giant that had organized the event to raise money for inner-city schools. The stage was a massive construction of aluminum framing and digital screens, positioned in front of the Olympic ring sculpture that had become one of Atlanta's most recognizable landmarks. Camera crews from every major network had claimed territory along the press riser, their equipment aimed at the podium like artillery. Max pulled against the lead, his attention fixed on something in the dense crowd to their left. Sarah followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual, just families and couples enjoying the morning, teenagers taking selfies, vendors hawking overpriced water bottles. She trusted Max's instincts implicitly, but she also knew that crowds this size produced an overwhelming barrage of scents and stimuli that could trigger false positives even in the most experienced working dogs. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice low and steady. She ran her fingers along the ridge of his skull, feeling the tension coiled beneath his short fur. "We'll do a sweep in a few minutes." The command center had established itself in a mobile unit, parked behind the stage, and Sarah's radio crackled with routine check-ins from the other teams. Everything was proceeding according to protocol. The bomb squad had cleared the venue at 4 in the morning, the Secret Service had signed off on the mayor's protection detail, and the private security contractors hired by Hammond Industries were supplementing the APD presence with their own personnel. On paper, it was one of the most secure events in the city's recent history. But Sarah had learned long ago that paper security meant nothing when you were standing in the chaos of reality. She had worked enough high-profile assignments to know that threats rarely announced themselves with convenient warning signs. They emerged from the mundane, from the overlooked, from the spaces between the checkpoints where human attention inevitably faltered. A production assistant wearing a headset and carrying a clipboard approached her with the harried expression of someone managing too many tasks simultaneously. "Lieutenant Collins," she said, slightly out of breath, "Ms. Reyes wants to know if she can interview you for the broadcast. Just a quick segment about the K-9 unit's role in event security." Sarah glanced at the press riser, where Maria Reyes, the most recognizable anchor in Atlanta television, was touching up her makeup while a technician adjusted her microphone. Reyes had built her career on a combination of journalistic credibility and telegenic charm, and her morning show regularly drew viewers from across the Southeast. An interview would mean standing in front of cameras while Max performed for the audience. The kind of public relations opportunity that the department encouraged, but that Sarah personally found uncomfortable. "Not today," Sarah replied. "We're working, not performing." The production assistant's face fell, but she nodded and retreated toward the press area. Sarah returned her attention to the crowd, which continued to swell as the event's start time approached. The temperature was climbing toward the mid-90s, and the air shimmered with heat rising from the pavement. She could feel sweat gathering beneath her tactical vest, the familiar discomfort of working in full gear under the summer sun. Max growled, a low vibration that Sarah felt through the lead before she heard it. His body had gone rigid, his weight shifting forward onto his front legs. His nose pointed toward a cluster of people near the fountain. Sarah followed his focus and saw nothing that should have triggered such a response, just a group of tourists consulting a map, a man in a business suit talking on his phone, a woman pushing a stroller, and several others moving through the space with the aimless patterns of people killing time before the speeches began. "What do you got?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She trusted Max more than she trusted any piece of technology or any intelligence briefing, and if he was alerting on something, there was a reason. The question was whether she could identify that reason before whatever he had detected became a crisis. She keyed her radio. Collins to command. "I've got a possible alert from my K-9 near the fountain on the east side, requesting permission to conduct a closer sweep." The response came after a brief delay. "Command to Collins. Negative on the sweep. We need you holding position at the main stage. The mayor arrives in 45 minutes. Sarah bit back her frustration. "Copy that command. Holding position." Max whined, his attention never wavering from the crowd near the fountain. Sarah could see the muscles in his hindquarters trembling with the effort of restraining himself, his training holding him in place, even as every instinct screamed at him to move toward whatever scent had captured his attention. She had worked with him long enough to recognize the difference between casual interest and genuine concern, and everything about his posture told her this was the latter. The next 30 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. The crowd continued to grow, filling the park with noise and movement that made systematic observation nearly impossible. Sarah maintained her position near the stage while Max grew increasingly agitated, his alerting behavior becoming more pronounced, even as she tried to calm him with verbal commands and physical reassurance. Twice more she requested permission to investigate, and twice more she was denied. The mayor's motorcade arrived at precisely 9:45, a convoy of black SUVs that swept through the secured entrance and deposited the city's chief executive onto a red carpet that had been rolled out for the occasion. Photographers swarmed the arrival point, their cameras clicking in a cacophony of mechanical shutters and electronic beeps. The mayor smiled and waved, flanked by his security detail and greeted by the executives from Hammond Industries, who escorted him toward the VIP area behind the stage. Maria Reyes had positioned herself at the edge of the press riser, her crew setting up for a live broadcast that would run continuously throughout the event's opening ceremonies. Sarah could hear her voice carrying across the space, professional and polished, welcoming viewers to the coverage and describing the scene with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades in front of cameras. "Good morning, Atlanta," Reyes was saying. "We're coming to you live from Centennial Olympic Park, where thousands have gathered for what promises to be a historic day of community celebration and corporate generosity. The temperature is already climbing toward record levels, but the heat hasn't dampened the enthusiasm of this incredible crowd." The camera panned across the audience, capturing images of families and friends enjoying the festivities. Sarah watched from her position near the stage, her attention divided between the broadcast and Max, who had begun to pace in tight circles at the end of his lead. His whining had become more insistent, and several nearby spectators were casting curious glances at the obviously distressed dog. "Max, heel!" Sarah commanded, putting steel into her voice. The Malinois obeyed instantly, returning to her side and sitting with his shoulder pressed against her leg, but his eyes never stopped moving across the crowd. He was looking for something, and his growing agitation told her he was getting closer to finding it. The speeches began with the CEO of Hammond Industries taking the podium to thunderous applause. He was a trim man in his 50s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding attention. His words washed over Sarah without registering. Corporate platitudes about community investment and educational opportunity that she had heard in various forms at countless similar events. What held her attention was Max, whose behavior had shifted from alerting to something closer to frenzy. His nose was working overtime, sampling the air in rapid bursts that Sarah could hear over the ambient noise of the crowd. His body was trembling with barely contained energy, every muscle coiled like a spring, waiting to release. She had seen him behave this way exactly once before, during a training exercise with live explosives, when his drive to locate the source of the scent had overwhelmed his normally impeccable obedience. "Collins to command," she radioed again, unable to keep the urgency from her voice. "My K-9 is showing sustained alerting behavior. I'm requesting immediate permission to conduct a sweep. This is not a drill." The pause before the response stretched into seconds that felt like hours. "Collins, this is command. The program is in progress. We cannot disrupt the event based on a dog's behavior. Hold your position." Sarah wanted to argue, to explain that Max's instincts had never been wrong, to demand that they take the threat seriously, but she was a professional, bound by chain of command and trained to follow orders even when every fiber of her being screamed that those orders were wrong. She acknowledged the directive and tried to keep Max calm, running her hand along his flank in slow, soothing strokes that did nothing to diminish his agitation. The CEO finished his remarks and introduced the mayor, who strode to the podium with the practiced confidence of a lifelong politician. The crowd applauded enthusiastically, cameras flashed, and Maria Reyes delivered commentary that Sarah could hear drifting from the nearby monitors. "And now the mayor takes the stage," Reyes narrated. "The city's leader has been a strong advocate for the educational initiatives that today's event will support. This partnership between Hammond Industries and the Atlanta public school system represents one of the largest private investments in education in the city's history." Max lunged. The movement was so sudden and so powerful that the lead tore from Sarah's grip before she could react. 7 years of training, countless hours of obedience work, and an unbroken record of controlled behavior all vanished in an instant, as the Malinois launched himself into the crowd with the single-minded determination of a missile seeking its target. Sarah sprinted after him, shoving through startled spectators and shouting commands that Max completely ignored. "Max, heel! Max, out!" But the dog was gone, weaving through the crowd with a speed and agility that left Sarah struggling to keep him in sight. She could hear the chaos erupting behind her, the confused murmur of the crowd becoming shouts of alarm as people realized that a police dog was charging through their midst, apparently out of control. Her radio exploded with traffic, voices overlapping, as multiple units demanded to know what was happening. On the press riser, Maria Reyes had stopped mid-sentence, her professional composure faltering as she watched the scene unfold. Her camera operator, sensing the drama, swung his lens to track the sprinting dog and the officer chasing him. Across Atlanta, and indeed across the entire nation through the network's live feed, millions of viewers watched as Max closed in on his target. He hit the man near the fountain with the full force of his 50-pound body, his jaws clamping onto the man's forearm as they both went down in a tangle of limbs and screaming. Sarah arrived seconds later, her weapon drawn, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to process what she was seeing. The man Max had attacked was unremarkable in every way. Middle-aged, average height, wearing khaki pants and a light jacket that seemed excessive for the temperature. His face was contorted in pain and terror as Max maintained his grip, growling with a ferocity that Sarah had never witnessed outside of controlled training environments. "Release!" Sarah commanded, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. "Max, out!" The Malinois obeyed instantly, releasing his grip and stepping back while maintaining his alert posture, his eyes fixed on the man, writhing on the ground. Blood was seeping from the bite wounds on the man's arm, but Sarah's attention was drawn to something else entirely. The jacket had ridden up during the struggle, revealing a glimpse of something underneath that made her blood run cold. "Don't move," she commanded, dropping to her knees beside the man while keeping her weapon trained on his center mass. She pulled back the jacket with her free hand and felt the world tilt beneath her. The explosive vest was professional work, constructed with the kind of precision that spoke of training and resources far beyond what a lone actor could assemble. Multiple charges were arranged in a pattern designed to maximize shrapnel dispersion, connected by wires to a triggering mechanism that the man's right hand was still reaching toward. Sarah grabbed that hand and wrenched it away from the device, pressing her full weight onto his chest as she screamed for backup. "Bomb!" she shouted into her radio. "I have a suspect with an explosive device near the fountain. I need the bomb squad now." The next minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. Bomb technicians arrived and took custody of the device, while patrol officers established a perimeter and began evacuating the immediate area. The man Sarah had restrained was handcuffed and led away, his face a mask of frustrated rage that told her more than any interrogation ever could. He had been seconds away from detonating his vest in the middle of a crowd of thousands, in front of cameras broadcasting to millions, and a Belgian Malinois named Max had stopped him with nothing but instinct and courage. The evacuation of the park took less than 20 minutes, a testament to the training and preparation of the officers on scene. The mayor was rushed to his motorcade and spirited away to a secure location. The executives from Hammond Industries were escorted from the venue by their private security, and the cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of the drama for an audience that had grown from local viewers to a national phenomenon as word spread of what had happened. Sarah sat on the tailgate of a patrol vehicle, Max pressed against her side, his body finally relaxed now that the threat had been neutralized. She ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the rapid beat of his heart gradually slowing to its normal rhythm. He had saved hundreds of lives today, possibly thousands, and he had done it by trusting his instincts even when his handler's commands told him to stand down. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. "You're such a good boy." A shadow fell across her, and she looked up to find Captain Morrison standing over her, his expression unreadable. The captain was a barrel-chested man in his late 50s, a veteran of the force who had seen everything the city could throw at him and had emerged with his principles intact. He was also the one who had denied her requests to investigate, and Sarah braced herself for whatever was coming. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice gruff, "you disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir." "You abandoned your assigned position during a high-profile event." "Yes, sir." "Your dog attacked a civilian on live television in front of millions of viewers." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir." He did. Morrison was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from Sarah to Max and back again. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "That dog just saved more lives than I can count," he said, "and you trusted him when nobody else would." He extended his hand. "Well done, Lieutenant. Both of you." Sarah shook his hand, relief flooding through her body. But even as she accepted the praise, her mind was already racing ahead to the questions that remained unanswered. The man with the vest, hadn't been working alone. The sophistication of the device, the planning required to get him past security, the specific targeting of a high-profile public event, all of it pointed to a larger organization with resources and capability that went far beyond a single individual. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start looking. The interrogation room at APD headquarters was deliberately uncomfortable, designed to break down resistance through a combination of hard chairs, harsh lighting, and the relentless pressure of time. The man they had arrested gave his name as Robert Harmon, a resident of Cobb County with no criminal record and a background in electrical engineering that explained his ability to construct the explosive device. He sat across the table from Sarah with an expression of sullen defiance, his wounded arm wrapped in bandages and his wrists secured to the table with handcuffs. Sarah had been given first crack at him, a recognition of her role in the arrest, and a tacit acknowledgement that she had earned the right to pursue the investigation. Max was with her, lying at her feet beneath the table, his presence a constant reminder to Harmon of how close he had come to achieving his goal, and how completely he had failed. "Who built the vest, Robert?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and measured. "Because we both know you didn't do it alone. That was professional work, military grade. Someone gave you that device, someone who knows what they're doing." Harmon said nothing, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Sarah's shoulder. "We've already traced the components," Sarah continued, allowing a note of satisfaction to creep into her voice. "The C4 came from a batch that was reported stolen from Fort Benning 3 months ago. Same batch that's been linked to attacks in 4 other states. So we know you're part of something bigger. The only question is whether you want to help us or whether you want to go down for terrorism all by yourself." Still nothing. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying Harmon's face for any crack in his facade. He was disciplined, she had to give him that. Whoever had trained him had done a thorough job of preparing him for capture. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "In about 2 hours, the FBI is going to walk through that door and take custody of you. They're going to transport you to a federal facility where you'll be held without bail pending trial on charges that carry the death penalty. You'll spend the rest of your life, however long or short that might be, in a supermax prison surrounded by concrete and razor wire. Your family, if you have one, will never see you again. Your friends will forget you ever existed. You'll die alone, and you'll die knowing that you failed." Something flickered in Harmon's eyes at the word failed, a brief flash of emotion that he quickly suppressed. Sarah caught it and filed it away for later. "Or," she continued, "you can help us. Give us names, locations, whatever you know about the people who supplied that vest. In exchange, I'll talk to the federal prosecutor about taking the death penalty off the table. You'll still do time, a lot of time, but you'll have a chance to see the outside world again someday." Harmon was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, bringing his face closer to Sarah's. "You think this is about me?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think if you catch enough of us, you'll stop what's coming, but you don't understand anything. We're everywhere. In the police, in the government, in the military. We've been planning this for years, and today was just the beginning." "Planning what?" Sarah demanded. "What's coming?" Harmon smiled, and the expression sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "The reckoning," he said. "And that dog of yours just bought you a little more time, but it's coming, soon, and when it does, nothing will stop it." Before Sarah could respond, the door opened, and 2 agents in FBI windbreakers entered the room. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with short grey hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, flashed her credentials. "Lieutenant Collins, thank you for your work. We'll take it from here." Sarah wanted to argue, to insist that she had built the rapport and should be the one to continue the interrogation. But she recognized the reality of the situation. Terrorism cases were federal jurisdiction, and her role in the investigation was effectively over. She rose from her chair, Max following at her heels. At the door, she paused and looked back at Harmon, who was watching her with that same unsettling smile. "We'll find them," she said. "Whoever they are, whatever they're planning, we'll stop them." Harmon's smile widened. "Good luck, Lieutenant. You're going to need it." The FBI took over the investigation with the efficiency of an organization accustomed to assuming control. Within hours, they had established a command center at their field office in Midtown, staffing it with agents from the Counterterrorism Division and analysts from multiple intelligence agencies. Sarah was thanked for her contribution and politely but firmly excluded from all subsequent briefings, but she couldn't let it go. Harmon's words echoed in her mind, the calm certainty with which he had spoken of reckoning and planning and people everywhere. If what he said was true, if there really was a network of conspirators embedded in positions of power throughout the government and military, then the threat went far beyond anything the FBI was likely to uncover through conventional investigation. She started with what she knew. The C-4 had been stolen from Fort Benning, which meant someone with access to military explosive storage had either taken it themselves or facilitated the theft. She made calls, pulled favors, and gradually assembled a picture of the incident that didn't match the official narrative. According to the Army's internal investigation, the theft had been committed by a lone actor, a supply sergeant who had subsequently disappeared. But the security footage from the depot told a different story, one of coordinated action by multiple individuals who had disabled cameras at precisely the right moments and navigated the facility with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. The supply sergeant, a man named Thomas Vance, had been found dead in his apartment 2 weeks after the theft, officially ruled a suicide. Sarah obtained a copy of the autopsy report through channels that she preferred not to think about too carefully. The medical examiner had noted defensive wounds on Vance's hands and arms, injuries inconsistent with a self-inflicted death. But someone had pressured the examiner to change the ruling, and the case had been closed without further investigation. She was dealing with people who had the power to cover up murder and manipulate official investigations, people inside the system, exactly as Harmon had claimed. Max seemed to sense her growing unease. He stayed closer than usual, his body pressed against her leg whenever they walked together, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. The bond between them had always been strong, but the events at the park had elevated it to something approaching telepathy. She knew what he was thinking before he moved, and he anticipated her commands before she gave them. 3 days after the arrest, Sarah received a visitor at her apartment. The knock came at 10 in the evening, late enough to be unusual, but not so late as to suggest emergency. She checked the peephole and saw a woman she didn't recognize, professionally dressed, mid-30s, with the controlled bearing of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. Sarah opened the door with her hand resting on the backup weapon she kept holstered at her ankle. "Can I help you?" The woman smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Lieutenant Collins? My name is Diana Vale. I work for a federal agency you've never heard of. May I come in?" Sarah's instincts screamed caution, but her curiosity was stronger. She stepped aside and allowed the woman to enter, keeping Max between them as a silent warning. The Malinois watched Vale with the same intensity he had shown at the park, his body tense but controlled. Vale settled into the armchair across from the couch, crossing her legs and placing her hands on her knees in a gesture of deliberate openness. "I've been following your investigation," she said. "The inquiries about Fort Benning, the autopsy report, the security footage. You've been very thorough." "If you're here to tell me to stop," Sarah replied, "save your breath." Vale shook her head. "Actually, I'm here to recruit you. The organization Harmon belongs to calls itself the Covenant. They've been operating in this country for over a decade, building networks and accumulating resources. We've been tracking them for almost as long, but we've never been able to penetrate their leadership, until now. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What do you mean, until now? Vale leaned forward, her eyes locked on Sarah's. What you did at the park, stopping Harmon's attack on live television, it got their attention. They're scared now, scared that their plans are unraveling, and scared people make mistakes. That's where you come in. Sarah glanced at Max, who was watching Vale with unwavering intensity. What exactly are you proposing? Vale smiled, and this time the expression seemed genuine. I'm proposing that you help us bring down the Covenant. From the inside, the decision to accept Vale's offer wasn't made lightly. Sarah spent 2 days weighing the risks and potential consequences, consulting with no one because there was no one she could trust with information this sensitive. In the end, it was Max who helped her decide. She watched him as he moved through his daily routine. The way he constantly surveyed their environment for threats, the way he positioned himself between her and any potential danger. He had spent his entire life protecting people, and he had never hesitated when it mattered. She owed him the same courage. The agency Vale worked for didn't officially exist. It operated in the spaces between other agencies, handling situations too sensitive for conventional law enforcement and too delicate for military intervention. Sarah was given a new identity, a backstory that would withstand casual investigation, and a target, a man named Marcus Webb, who was believed to be one of the Covenant's senior operatives in the southeast region. Webb was a businessman on the surface, the CEO of a logistics company that operated shipping terminals throughout the Gulf Coast. His company moved legitimate cargo, thousands of containers every month flowing through ports in Mobile, New Orleans, and Houston. But the agency suspected that some of those containers carried something else entirely: weapons, explosives, and the materials needed to execute the attacks the Covenant was planning. Sarah's cover was as a security consultant, hired by Webb's company to assess vulnerabilities in their operations. It was a role that gave her access to facilities and personnel while providing a plausible explanation for the questions she would need to ask. Max came with her, ostensibly as a demonstration of the capabilities she could bring to the company's protection efforts. The first meeting with Webb took place at his corporate headquarters in Mobile, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that overlooked the bay. Sarah had studied his file extensively, memorizing the details of his background and building a psychological profile that would help her navigate their interactions. He was intelligent, charismatic, and utterly ruthless, a man who had built his empire through a combination of business acumen and willingness to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. "Miss Mitchell," Webb said, rising from behind his desk to greet her. The name felt foreign on her tongue, but she had practiced it enough times that her response was automatic. "Thank you for coming. I've heard impressive things about your work." Sarah shook his hand, noting the strength of his grip and the coldness in his eyes. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Webb. Your operation is extensive. I'm looking forward to analyzing your security protocols." Webb gestured for her to sit, his gaze moving to Max with obvious interest. "And this is the famous K-9 I've read about, the one from the park." Sarah's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "He was involved in some training exercises that got media attention," she said carefully. "He's very effective at threat detection." "I'm sure he is," Webb replied, his tone suggesting he knew more than he was saying. "Well, let's begin. I'll have my operations manager show you around the facilities." The tour lasted 3 hours and covered the main shipping terminal, the warehouse complex, and the administrative offices where Webb's legitimate business was managed. Sarah took careful mental notes, identifying security gaps that were real and others that seemed almost deliberately created, as if someone wanted to provide cover for activities that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Max remained alert throughout, his nose working constantly as they moved through the cavernous spaces of the terminal. Twice he showed interest in specific containers, his body language suggesting the presence of something that warranted investigation. Sarah noted the container numbers and filed them away for later. That evening, in the hotel room the agency had secured for her, she reported her findings to Vale through a secure communication channel. "Webb knows something," she said. "The way he mentioned Max, he wasn't just making conversation, he was testing me." Vale's voice crackled through the encrypted line. "We expected he might be aware of your real identity. The question is whether he's decided to play along because he thinks he can use you or because he's planning to eliminate you." "Either way, I need to move faster," Sarah replied. "Those containers Max alerted on, if they're holding what I think they're holding, we can't afford to wait." "Agreed," Vale said. "We'll arrange surveillance on the terminal. You focus on getting closer to Webb. We need to know when and where the next attack is planned." The next 2 weeks were a delicate dance of deception. Sarah embedded herself in Webb's organization, working long hours at the terminal and gradually building a rapport with his key personnel. She was careful to appear competent but not threatening, ambitious but not suspicious. She asked questions that a legitimate security consultant would ask and carefully avoided the topics that would reveal her true purpose. Max was her constant companion, and his presence provided both protection and intelligence. His nose could detect things that no technology could match, and Sarah had learned to read his signals with near-perfect accuracy. When he showed interest in a particular area or container, she found ways to investigate without arousing suspicion. She discovered that Webb's operation was even more extensive than the agency had suspected. The shipping terminal was just one node in a network that stretched across the country, moving not only weapons and explosives, but also money and people. The Covenant was funding its operations through a combination of legitimate business profits and illegal trafficking, and Webb was the hub through which everything flowed. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when Webb invited her to dinner at his private residence. It was a test, she knew, an opportunity for him to assess her outside the controlled environment of the office. She accepted, knowing that refusal would raise suspicions she couldn't afford. Webb's home was a mansion on the bay, surrounded by manicured gardens and protected by a security system that Sarah had professionally assessed as excellent. She arrived at 7, dressed in clothes that balanced professionalism with appropriate elegance, and was met at the door by a butler who escorted her to a dining room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. Webb was already seated, a glass of wine in his hand and a smile on his face that didn't match the calculating look in his eyes. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, rising to greet her, "I'm glad you could join me." Sarah took the seat across from him, accepting the wine he poured, and waiting while the staff served the first course. The conversation remained light through the appetizer and soup, touching on business matters and industry trends. It wasn't until the main course arrived that Webb's tone changed. "Tell me," he said, setting down his fork and fixing her with a penetrating stare, "what do you really want?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I told you, I want to help you secure your operations." Webb shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. I think you're looking for something else, something you believe I have." The silence stretched between them, charged with tension that Sarah could feel in her bones. Max, who had been lying quietly at her feet, rose to a sitting position, his attention fixed on Webb. "You're very good," Webb continued. "Your cover is excellent. Your credentials are impeccable. But you made a mistake, Ms. Mitchell. Or should I say, Lieutenant Collins." Sarah's hand moved toward the weapon she had concealed at her ankle, but before she could reach it, 2 men emerged from doorways on either side of the room, their guns already drawn and aimed at her chest. "I wouldn't," Webb said, his smile widening. "You're fast, but not that fast, and your dog can't outrun bullets." Sarah slowly raised her hands, her mind racing through options and finding none that ended well. "How long have you known?" "Since the beginning," Webb replied. "Did you really think we don't have people in the agency that sent you? We know everything they know. We've been watching their investigation from the start." The weight of his words settled over Sarah like a physical burden. If the Covenant had penetrated Vale's agency, then everything she had reported had gone straight to the enemy. Her investigation, her findings, her suspicions, all of it had been shared with the very people she was trying to stop. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. Webb rose from his chair and walked around the table, stopping when he was close enough for her to see the threads of grey in his hair. "Now," he said, "you become useful to us. You see, your appearance at that park, stopping Harmon's attack, it created a problem for us. The public loves you. The media loves you. You're a hero, and we've learned that heroes can be very useful when they're working for our side. I'll never work for you." Webb laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Everyone says that at first. But everyone has leverage, Lieutenant. Something they care about more than their principles. For you, I suspect, it's that dog." Max growled, low and threatening, his hackles rising as he sensed the danger in Webb's tone. "We've developed a synthetic compound," Webb continued, "that attacks the central nervous system of K-9s, completely untraceable, completely lethal. One injection, and your partner will be dead within the hour." Webb leaned closer, his breath warm on Sarah's face. "But I don't want to kill him. I want you to understand that I can, and that if you cooperate, I won't." Sarah felt something cold and hard settle into her chest, replacing the fear with something far more dangerous. Whatever Webb saw in her eyes made him take a step back, his confidence faltering for just a moment. "Let me tell you something about Max," she said, her voice quiet and deadly. "He spent the last 7 years protecting people, saving lives, stopping threats that nobody else could even detect. And in all that time, do you know what he's never done?" She paused, letting the silence build. "He's never killed anyone. But that's because I've never let him." "Max, guard." The command was one they had practiced 1,000 times, a signal that released all of Max's training and instinct in a controlled burst of violence. He launched himself at the nearest gunman before the man could react, his jaws closing on the arm, holding the weapon and wrenching it aside as they both crashed to the floor. The gun discharged into the ceiling, and Sarah was already moving, rolling out of her chair and coming up with her backup weapon in her hand. The second gunman hesitated, torn between shooting the dog and the woman, and that hesitation cost him everything. Sarah fired twice, sent a mass, and he crumpled against the wall. Webb was running, sprinting toward a door at the back of the room. Sarah gave chase, leaving Max to deal with the first gunman. She caught Webb in the hallway, tackling him from behind and slamming him against the wall hard enough to crack the plaster. "It's over," she said, pressing the muzzle of her weapon against the back of his skull. "Tell me everything." Webb laughed, blood trickling from his split lip. "You think this is over? This is nothing. The operation is already in motion. Even if you kill me, it won't stop anything." "What operation? Where?" Webb turned his head, meeting her eyes with a look of triumph even in defeat. "Atlanta," he said, "the airport. Tomorrow. 10,000 people are going to die, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Sarah struck him across the temple with her weapon, and he slumped unconscious against the wall. She keyed the emergency frequency on her concealed radio. "Vale," she said, "we have a problem." The next 12 hours were the most intense of Sarah's life. Vale's agency mobilized every resource at its disposal, coordinating with the FBI, TSA, and Hartsfield-Jackson Airport security to prevent the attack Webb had described. Sarah and Max were transported back to Atlanta by helicopter, arriving at the airport in the pre-dawn darkness. The scope of the operation was staggering. Intelligence obtained from Webb's computer files, seized by agency technicians minutes after Sarah's call, revealed a coordinated assault planned for the busiest terminal during the morning rush. Multiple operatives equipped with explosive vests would detonate simultaneously, creating a cascade of death and destruction that would dwarf anything the country had experienced since September 11th. But the Covenant had underestimated two things: the speed with which Sarah could extract information, and Max's ability to find what needed to be found. By 6 in the morning, every K-9 unit in the metropolitan area had been deployed to the airport. Max led the sweep of Terminal A, his nose working through the crowds of early travelers with mechanical efficiency. Sarah followed close behind, her eyes scanning faces while her partner scanned scents. The first operative was identified near the Delta check-in counter. Max alerted, Sarah confirmed, and plainclothes officers moved in to make the arrest before the man could reach for his detonator. The second was found in the security line, disguised as a business traveler. The third was in a bathroom preparing his device. One by one, Max tracked them down. His instincts, honed by years of training and experience, cut through the chaos of the crowded airport with laser precision. Each time he alerted, Sarah's heart stopped, knowing that any one of these individuals could trigger an explosion that would kill everyone within 100 yards, and each time the threat was neutralized before it could materialize. By 9 in the morning, when the attack was scheduled to occur, 7 operatives had been arrested and their devices recovered. The airport remained open, travelers continued their journeys, and the world outside had no idea how close it had come to catastrophe. Sarah sat on a bench near Gate B12, Max's head resting in her lap, and allowed herself to feel the exhaustion that she had been holding at bay through sheer willpower. Her hands were trembling, her body aching from the accumulated stress of the past 24 hours. But they had done it. Against impossible odds, they had stopped the attack. Vale approached, looking as composed as ever despite the circumstances. "The agency is taking credit for the operation," she said. "Publicly, it will be reported as a successful intelligence operation that prevented a domestic terrorism event. Your name won't be mentioned." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "And Webb? In custody. He's already negotiating a plea deal in exchange for information about the Covenant's leadership." Vale paused, her expression softening slightly. "You did good work, Lieutenant. Better than good. You saved a lot of lives today." "We saved lives," Sarah corrected, running her fingers through Max's fur. "I just followed his lead." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of debriefings, investigations, and media management. The public story of the thwarted attack bore little resemblance to reality, but Sarah had learned long ago that truth was often the first casualty of national security. What mattered was that the Covenant had been dealt a crippling blow, its leadership exposed, and its networks dismantled across multiple states. Webb's testimony led to the arrest of dozens of conspirators, including several who held positions in government and law enforcement, exactly as Harmon had warned. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had suspected, but now it was being rooted out, one traitor at a time. Sarah returned to her normal duties with the K-9 unit, grateful for the routine after the intensity of the undercover operation. Max seemed equally content, his energy directed once again toward the familiar challenges of patrol work and public events. The bond between them, already unbreakable, had deepened into something that defied easy description. 1 month after the airport operation, Sarah received a package at her apartment. There was no return address, but inside she found a framed photograph of herself and Max at the charity event in the park, taken moments before Max had launched himself into the crowd. Someone had captured the exact instant when the Malinois had made his decision, his muscles coiled for action, his eyes fixed on his target. Beneath the photo was a simple inscription, "For the ones who see what others miss." Sarah hung the photograph in her living room where it caught the morning light and reminded her daily of everything they had accomplished together. The covenant was broken, its plans thwarted, its leaders facing justice. Atlanta was safe, at least for now. But she knew that threats never truly disappeared. They evolved, adapted, found new ways to manifest their hatred and violence. Somewhere out there, other conspiracies were forming, other attacks being planned, and when they came, she and Max would be ready. 6 months later, Sarah was promoted to captain, the youngest in the department's history. The ceremony was held at City Hall, with the mayor presenting her with the badge, and the crowd applauding with genuine warmth. Max sat beside her on the stage, wearing a ceremonial vest that bore every commendation and medal he had earned over his years of service. As Sarah accepted her new badge, she looked out at the audience and saw faces she recognized, colleagues who had doubted her, commanders who had questioned her judgment, and officers who had learned to trust her instincts. They were all here now, celebrating her achievement, acknowledging that she had earned this moment. But her eyes were drawn to one face in particular. Maria Reyes sat in the front row, a camera crew positioned beside her, ready to capture the moment for the evening news. The anchor who had witnessed Max's first dramatic intervention was now documenting the culmination of everything that had followed. After the ceremony, Reyes approached with her microphone and her practiced smile. "Captain Collins," she said, "congratulations on your promotion. Tell me, what's next for you and Max?" Sarah considered the question, her hand resting on Max's head as it always did when she needed to think. "We keep doing what we've always done," she said finally, "protecting people, stopping threats, making sure that when the bad guys think they've won, they learn they were wrong. And what would you say to anyone out there who's planning something, anyone who thinks they can get away with it?" Sarah looked directly into the camera, and for a moment she wasn't speaking to the audience watching at home. She was speaking to every conspirator still hiding in the shadows, every terrorist planning their next attack, every criminal who thought they were smarter than the people sworn to stop them. "I would say that we're watching," she replied. "We're always watching. And no matter how careful you think you've been, no matter how clever your plan, there's a dog out there who can smell your fear. And when he finds you, and he will find you, you're going to wish you'd made better choices." The interview ended, and Reyes thanked her before moving off to find other stories. Sarah watched her go, then looked down at Max, who was watching her with the patient loyalty that defined their partnership. "Ready to go to work?" she asked. Max's tail wagged once, a simple gesture that conveyed everything that needed to be said. Together, they walked out of City Hall and into the Atlanta afternoon, ready for whatever came next. The summer heat had finally broken, giving way to the crisp clarity of early autumn. The city seemed renewed, its streets bustling with energy that felt different from the oppressive weight of the months before. Sarah had noticed it in the weeks since the airport operation, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that suggested people were breathing a little easier, walking a little taller, but she knew better than to mistake calm for safety. The intelligence briefings continued, a steady stream of information about threats both foreign and domestic. The Covenant had been wounded, but not destroyed. Cells that had gone dark after Webb's arrest were beginning to show signs of activity. Communications were being intercepted, patterns were being analyzed, and somewhere in the labyrinth of data, the next attack was taking shape. Sarah had requested assignment to the task force, coordinating the ongoing investigation, and her request had been granted with an enthusiasm that surprised her. Her performance during the airport operation had elevated her reputation beyond the confines of the K-9 unit, and she was now recognized as a valuable asset for exactly the kind of unconventional threat she had spent the past months confronting. The task force operated out of a secure facility in Buckhead, a nondescript office building that concealed one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in the Southeast. Sarah reported there twice a week, reviewing case files, contributing her insights, and maintaining the connections she had built during the undercover operation. It was during one of these sessions that she learned about the next phase of the Covenant's plan. The analyst presenting the briefing was a young man named Patterson, whose pale complexion and nervous energy suggested someone who spent more time with computers than with people. He pulled up a series of satellite images on the conference room screen, pointing to locations scattered across the Atlanta metropolitan area. "We've identified what we believe are staging areas," he said, his voice carrying the particular urgency of someone who understood the implications of what he was showing. "Warehouses, primarily in industrial zones where surveillance is minimal. The pattern matches what we saw before the airport operation." Sarah studied the images, her mind already racing through tactical considerations. "How many locations?" "7 confirmed," Patterson replied. "Possibly more we haven't found yet." "And the timeline?" Patterson hesitated, glancing at the senior agents seated around the table. "Based on communications intercepts and pattern analysis, we believe they're planning something for next month, the anniversary of the park incident." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The attack at the charity event had been thwarted exactly 1 year ago, and the Covenant was apparently planning to mark the occasion with something even more devastating. It was the kind of symbolic timing that terrorist organizations loved, transforming defeat into a rallying cry for renewed violence. "What's the target?" she asked. Patterson shook his head. "We don't know yet, but the scale of the preparation suggests something significant, something that would make the airport operation look small by comparison." The meeting continued for another hour, covering surveillance protocols, resource allocation, and interagency coordination. Sarah contributed where she could, but her thoughts kept returning to Max, who was waiting for her at the K-9 facility on the other side of town. He had been her partner through everything, and she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The drive to the facility took longer than usual. Traffic snarled by construction and the general chaos of a city that never seemed to stop growing. Sarah used the time to think, running through scenarios and contingencies with the systematic thoroughness that had become second nature. When she arrived, Max greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, his body wriggling with barely contained joy at her return. She knelt beside him, letting him lick her face while she ran her hands through his fur. "We've got work to do, buddy," she murmured. "Big work." Over the next 3 weeks, Sarah and Max conducted surveillance on the identified staging areas, working in coordination with the task force to build a picture of the Covenant's renewed operation. They moved through industrial zones in the pre-dawn darkness, Max's nose sampling the air for traces of explosives, while Sarah documented everything they found. The evidence accumulated slowly but steadily. Chemical residue consistent with TATP production, vehicle traffic patterns that matched surveillance of known Covenant associates, cellular signals that bounced off towers near multiple staging areas in sequence, suggesting coordination between dispersed elements. It was enough to justify action, but not enough to determine what that action should be. The task force debated endlessly, weighing the risks of moving too soon against the dangers of waiting too long. Every day that passed was another day for the Covenant to complete their preparations. But every premature raid risked alerting the conspirators and driving them underground, only to resurface somewhere else at some other time. Sarah argued for aggressive action, her instincts screaming that delay would only benefit the enemy. But she was overruled by senior officials who wanted more intelligence, more certainty, more cover for the political fallout that would follow any operation. The break came from an unexpected source. 3 days before the anniversary, Sarah received a call from an unregistered number. The voice on the other end was digitally distorted, impossible to identify, but the message was clear. "Lieutenant Collins, you stopped us once. You won't stop us again. But I'm giving you this chance because I believe in fair play. Piedmont Park. Midnight. Come alone. Or don't come at all. The line went dead before she could respond. Sarah stared at her phone, her heart pounding. Every protocol she had been trained to follow demanded that she report the call, inform the task force, and let them handle whatever came next. But something in her gut told her that following protocol would mean losing the only lead they had. She made her decision. At 11:30 that night, she pulled her personal vehicle into a parking space near the edge of Piedmont Park. Max was in the back seat, invisible behind the tinted windows, but ready to move at her command. She had worn her service weapon openly, making no attempt to conceal it, and had informed exactly no one of where she was going. The park was quiet at this hour, the walking paths empty, the playgrounds deserted. Sarah moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had spent years navigating far more dangerous environments. Max padded silently beside her, his ears rotating to catch sounds that human hearing could never detect. They reached the designated meeting point, a clearing near the lake where the city lights reflected off the still water. Sarah stopped and waited, every sense straining for any indication of threat. A figure emerged from the shadows, male, tall, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew they were being watched. He stopped 10 feet from Sarah, his hands visible at his sides, his face obscured by the darkness. "You came alone," he said. "Good. You said you believe in fair play," Sarah replied. "Prove it. Tell me what's planned." The figure was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested internal conflict. "The anniversary attack. It's not what you think. Then what is it?" "A distraction," he said. "Something big enough to draw every law enforcement resource in the city. While you're dealing with that, the real operation happens somewhere else." "What operation? Where?" The figure hesitated, and Sarah could sense the battle playing out behind his hidden face. "CDC headquarters," he said finally. "A biological agent. Something that will spread before anyone knows what's happening." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, located just miles from where she stood, held samples of the deadliest pathogens known to science. An attack there could unleash a pandemic that would dwarf anything the world had seen. "Why are you telling me this?" she demanded. "Because I didn't sign up for this," the figure replied. "Bombs, guns, tactical strikes, those I understand. But this, what they're planning, it's genocide. It's the end of everything, and I can't be part of that." He reached slowly into his jacket and withdrew an envelope, which he tossed at Sarah's feet. "Everything you need is in there. Location of the assault team, timeline, access codes. You have 48 hours. The figure began to back away, retreating toward the darkness from which he had emerged. "Wait," Sarah called. "Who are you?" He paused, just for a moment. "Someone who still believes in something," he said, "or at least someone who wants to." And then he was gone, swallowed by the night. Sarah picked up the envelope and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a flash drive and a single sheet of paper covered in handwritten notes. She scanned the contents quickly, her tactical mind absorbing the information and translating it into actionable intelligence. The plan was elegant in its horror. While decoy attacks drew responders to multiple locations throughout the city, a specialized team would breach the CDC's biosafety containment facility and release a modified strain of influenza engineered for maximum transmissibility. By the time anyone realized what had happened, the contagion would be spreading exponentially, and no quarantine would be able to contain it. She had 48 hours to stop it. The next 2 days were a blur of activity. Sarah brought the intelligence to the task force, weathering the initial skepticism until the technical specialists confirmed that the flash drive contained authentic access codes and security protocols. The CDC went to full lockdown while a joint operation was planned to intercept the assault team before they could reach their target. Sarah insisted on being part of the strike team, and this time no one argued. She and Max had proven themselves too many times to be excluded from the decisive moment. The assault team's staging area was a farmhouse in rural DeKalb County, surrounded by fields that provided clear sightlines in every direction. The operation began at 4 in the morning on the anniversary date, with FBI hostage rescue and Atlanta SWAT approaching from multiple angles, while helicopter support maintained overwatch. Sarah and Max were with the primary assault element, positioned to breach the main entrance on command. She could feel Max trembling with anticipation beside her, his body coiled like a spring, his eyes fixed on the door they would soon be entering. The countdown came through her earpiece. 3, 2, 1, execute. The door exploded inward, and Sarah was through before the debris had settled. Max was ahead of her, a blur of brown fur and flashing teeth, taking down the first armed man before he could raise his weapon. Sarah fired at a second target, then a third, her shots precise and controlled. The house was chaos, muzzle flashes and shouting, and the controlled violence of professionals doing what they had trained to do. Sarah moved from room to room, Max always at her side, until they reached the basement where the biological agent was being stored. 3 men were there, surrounding a case that contained the modified pathogen. One of them held a detonator, his finger poised over the trigger. "Don't," Sarah commanded, her weapon aimed at his center mass. "It's over." The man smiled, an expression of fanatic certainty that Sarah had seen too many times before. "It's never over," he said. "Even if you kill me, others will continue the work. The covenant is eternal." Max growled, low and threatening, and the man's eyes flickered to the dog for just a moment. That moment was all Sarah needed. She fired, the bullet taking him in the shoulder and spinning him away from the case. The detonator clattered to the floor, harmless, and Max was on him before he could reach for it. The other 2 men surrendered immediately, their hands raised, their faces masks of defeated rage. It was over. The biological agent was recovered intact and transported to a secure facility for disposal. The assault team members were arrested and processed, adding their confessions to the mountain of evidence that was already burying the Covenant's leadership. And Sarah, exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, finally allowed herself to believe that they had won. The anniversary passed without incident. The decoy attacks never materialized, their operatives arrested in coordinated raids throughout the city. The media covered the story with breathless excitement, though as usual, the public version bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. Sarah didn't care. She had done her job, and that was enough. A month later, she was summoned to a ceremony at the governor's mansion. The event was private. Attendance restricted to a handful of senior officials and the members of the task force who had made the operation possible. Sarah wore her dress uniform, freshly pressed, and Max wore the ceremonial vest that displayed his years of service. The governor was a distinguished woman in her 60s, with silver hair and a handshake that conveyed genuine respect. "Captain Collins," she said, "what you've accomplished cannot be adequately recognized in public, but I want you to know that everyone in this room understands the debt this state owes you." Sarah accepted the commendation she was offered, a small medal that would join the others in her display case at home. Max received his own recognition, a plaque that designated him as an official hero of the state of Georgia. Afterward, as the gathering dispersed and Sarah prepared to leave, she was approached by Diana Vale. The agent who had started her on this journey looked different somehow, less composed, more human than she had seemed during their previous encounters. "I'm leaving the agency," Vale said. "After this, after everything we've been through, I need something different. What will you do?" Vale smiled. And for the first time, the expression seemed completely genuine. "I don't know yet. Maybe I'll write a book, or teach, or just find somewhere quiet and try to forget everything I've seen." Sarah nodded, understanding the impulse, even if she didn't share it. "You have my number," she said. "If you ever need anything." Vale reached out and squeezed her hand. "Take care of yourself, Lieutenant." "Captain, whatever they're calling you now. And take care of that dog. He's one of the good ones." She walked away, disappearing into the evening with the same quiet confidence she had shown when she first appeared at Sarah's door. Sarah looked down at Max, who was watching her with the patient attention that defined their relationship. "Ready to go home, buddy?" Max's tail wagged once, and together they walked out of the mansion and into the Georgia night. The city stretched before them, its lights twinkling against the darkness like stars brought to earth. Somewhere out there, new threats were taking shape, new conspiracies forming in the shadows where violence breeds. But for now, for this moment, Atlanta was safe. And Sarah knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever came next, she and Max would face it together. They always did. The autumn wind carried the scent of approaching change, and Max's nose worked as they walked, cataloguing every smell that drifted past. Sarah watched him work, marveling as she always did at the precision of his senses, the way he navigated a world of information that humans could barely imagine. He had saved more lives than she could count. He had stopped threats that would have devastated the city, the region, possibly the entire country. And he had done it all with nothing but instinct, training, and an unbreakable loyalty that humbled everyone who witnessed it. "Good boy," Sarah murmured, running her hand along his flank. "You're such a good boy." Max looked up at her, his dark eyes reflecting the streetlights, and in that moment, Sarah understood something that she had always known, but never articulated. They weren't partners because the department had assigned them together. They weren't a team because regulations required it. They were connected by something deeper, something that transcended the boundaries of species and spoke to the fundamental truth of what it meant to serve. They had both chosen this life, and they would both see it through to the end. The car was parked at the end of the block, waiting to take them home to the apartment they shared, to the routines they had built, to the life they had earned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to make a difference in a world that desperately needed people who gave a damn. But tonight, they had won. Sarah opened the back door, and Max jumped in, settling onto his blanket with the satisfied exhaustion of a job well done. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. The city lights faded in the rearview mirror as they drove toward home, toward rest, toward the peace that was always temporary, but always treasured. Until the next call came, until the next threat emerged, until the next time Atlanta needed its heroes. And when that time came, Captain Sarah Collins and K-9 Max would be ready. They always were. The following morning brought the kind of clarity that only comes after crisis has passed. Sarah woke before dawn, as she always did, and found Max already alert on his bed beside hers. His ears perked toward sounds that existed beyond the range of human perception. She reached down and scratched behind his ear, feeling the familiar texture of his fur beneath her fingers. "Coffee first," she said, swinging her legs out of bed. "Then we see what the day brings." The apartment was modest by any standard, a two-bedroom unit in a quiet complex near the training facility where Max spent his off-duty hours. Sarah had never cared much for luxury, preferring functionality over aesthetics, and the space reflected that preference. Her awards and commendations hung on one wall, photographs of colleagues and operations on another. The refrigerator held the basics: protein for her and for Max, vegetables she rarely remembered to eat, and an endless supply of the energy drinks that had become essential to her lifestyle. She made her coffee strong and stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the Atlanta skyline. The city looked different in this light, softer somehow, stripped of the shadows and secrets that defined her working hours. She could almost believe it was just another metropolis, just another collection of people living their lives without knowledge of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. But she knew better. She had seen that darkness up close, had fought it hand to hand, had watched Max tear it apart with his teeth, and she knew that no matter how peaceful the morning seemed, the night would always bring new challenges. Her phone buzzed with a message from Captain Morrison, briefing at 0800. Your presence requested. Sarah smiled slightly. Even now, with everything she had accomplished, the bureaucracy of police work continued unabated. There would be reports to file, forms to complete, supervisors to satisfy. The unglamorous machinery of law enforcement that made the dramatic moments possible. She showered, dressed in her uniform with the newly added captain's insignia, and loaded Max into the departmental vehicle she had been assigned. The drive to headquarters took 20 minutes, enough time to organize her thoughts and prepare for whatever the briefing would reveal. The conference room was already full when she arrived, officers and analysts filling every available seat. Morrison stood at the front, his expression conveying the particular combination of determination and exhaustion that characterized senior leadership after major operations. "Good morning," he said as Sarah took her place. "Let's get started." The briefing covered the aftermath of the Covenant operation, the ongoing investigations, the arrests that continued to mount as cooperating witnesses identified additional conspirators. The organization had been dealt a devastating blow, but its complete destruction remained a work in progress. "We've identified 17 additional suspects based on Webb's testimony," Morrison reported. "Arrests are being coordinated with federal partners across 6 states. The Attorney General has described this as the most significant counterterrorism success since the takedown of domestic militia networks in the 90s. There was murmured satisfaction around the room, the collective acknowledgement of work well done. But Sarah noticed that Morrison's expression remained troubled, suggesting that the good news was balanced by something less encouraging. "However," he continued, "we have reason to believe that elements of the Covenant leadership remain at large. Communications intercepts suggest they've established contact with international partners, possibly including state actors hostile to our interests. The threat hasn't been eliminated. It's evolved." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. "What are we doing about it?" Morrison met her gaze. "That's where you come in, Captain. The Bureau has requested your assignment to a joint task force focused on identifying and neutralizing remaining Covenant assets. Your experience with their operations makes you uniquely qualified. For how long?" "As long as it takes," Morrison replied. "The director has approved a temporary transfer. You'll maintain your rank and status with Atlanta PD, but your operational authority will extend to the full scope of the task force's jurisdiction." Sarah considered the implications. An assignment like this would take her away from the K-9 unit, from the routine patrol work that had defined her career. But it would also put her at the forefront of the fight against the most dangerous threat the country had faced in years. "What about Max?" she asked. Morrison smiled slightly. "The Bureau specifically requested his inclusion. Apparently his reputation precedes him. The task force established its operations center in a secure facility outside the city, a former corporate campus that had been converted into a hub of intelligence gathering and analysis. Sarah and Max reported there the following Monday, entering a world that bore little resemblance to the police work she had known. The analysts were younger than she expected, most of them barely out of their 20s, with the pale complexions and intense focus of people who spent their lives staring at screens. They tracked communications across dozens of platforms, identified patterns in seemingly random data, and constructed the intricate networks that revealed how the Covenant operated. Sarah's role was different. She was the tip of the spear, the operational asset who would translate intelligence into action when the time came. Max would be her partner in that work, his senses providing capabilities that no technology could match. Their first target was a financier named Alexander Steele, who had been identified as a key supporter of Covenant operations through a web of shell companies and offshore accounts. Steele lived in a gated community in Buckhead, protected by private security and the assumption that wealth provided immunity from consequence. Sarah spent 2 weeks conducting surveillance, learning his patterns, identifying vulnerabilities in his security. Max accompanied her on these operations. His presence explained as a personal protection measure that Steele's neighbors accepted without question. The wealthy were accustomed to eccentricity, and a woman with a trained attack dog barely registered on their radar. The arrest came on a Tuesday morning, coordinated with simultaneous operations against Steele's business partners in 3 other cities. Sarah led the entry team, Max at her heel, breaching the front door of the mansion while the security guards were still reaching for their weapons. Steele was in his study when they found him, surrounded by the trappings of wealth that suddenly seemed very fragile. He was a small man, physically unremarkable, with the soft features of someone who had never faced real adversity. When he saw Max's bared teeth, he collapsed into his chair and began to weep. The interrogation that followed revealed more about the Covenant's financial infrastructure than months of analysis had uncovered. Steele was a coward at heart, more concerned with his own comfort than any ideological commitment, and he gave up everything he knew in exchange for promises of reduced charges. His testimony led to additional arrests, which led to additional testimony, which led to still more arrests. The network unraveled like a sweater with a pulled thread, each loose end revealing connections to others who had believed themselves safe. Through it all, Sarah and Max remained at the center of operations. They traveled to 7 states in 6 months, conducting arrests and providing the tactical expertise that the analysts' intelligence made possible. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and profoundly satisfying, but it was also taking a toll. Sarah noticed it first in Max, the slight hesitation in his movements that hadn't been there before, the way he favored his left rear leg after long operations, the grey hairs appearing around his muzzle. He was 8 years old now, past the prime of his career, and the accumulated wear of years of service was beginning to show. The veterinarian confirmed what Sarah had feared: early-stage arthritis in his hips, likely exacerbated by the physical demands of tactical work. He could continue operating, but every mission increased the risk of serious injury. Sarah sat in the examination room after the diagnosis, her hand resting on Max's head as she processed the implications. He looked up at her with the same loyal attention he'd always shown, unaware of the limitations that time had imposed on his body. "It's okay, buddy," she murmured. "We'll figure it out." She requested a meeting with the task force commander, a career FBI agent named Harrison, who had overseen the Covenant operation from its inception. He was a pragmatic man, focused on results, but he had also developed genuine respect for the K-9 unit that had contributed so much to their success. "I understand your concern," Harrison said when she explained the situation, "but I can't promise anything. The operational tempo isn't going to slow down just because one dog is getting older." "He's not just one dog," Sarah replied, keeping her voice carefully controlled. "He's identified more targets, provided more actionable intelligence, and saved more lives than any other asset this task force has deployed. If he goes down in the field, we lose everything he represents." Harrison was silent for a long moment. "What do you suggest? Reduced operational load, focus on the most critical targets, and when he can't do it anymore, a retirement that honors his service?" Harrison nodded slowly. "I can work with that, but I need your commitment that you'll continue operating as long as he's able. The Covenant isn't finished, and neither are we." Sarah extended her hand. "Deal." The months that followed established a new rhythm to their work. Sarah and Max continued to participate in operations, but their role shifted toward high-priority targets, where Max's capabilities were most essential. The routine arrests were handled by other teams, preserving Max's strength for the moments that truly mattered. They tracked a weapons dealer in Memphis, a courier network in Chicago, a recruitment cell in Phoenix. Each operation brought them closer to the remaining Covenant leadership, the shadowy figures who had escaped the initial crackdown and continued to direct operations from hiding. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the analysts, a young woman named Chen, who specialized in communication patterns, identified a recurring signal that appeared to originate from somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The signal was heavily encrypted, but its pattern matched communications that had preceded major Covenant operations. "Someone important is up there," Chen reported. "Someone who doesn't want to be found." Sarah studied the map, tracing the terrain with her finger. It was rugged country, difficult to access, easy to defend, the kind of place where someone could hide indefinitely if they were careful. "We need ground truth," she said. "Surveillance from above won't be enough. I need to get up there and see what we're dealing with." Harrison authorized the reconnaissance operation, and 3 days later, Sarah and Max were hiking through the mountain forest with a small team of tactical operators. The terrain was challenging, steep slopes covered with dense vegetation that made movement slow and exhausting. Max ranged ahead, his nose working the wind for any trace of human presence. He had been trained in wilderness tracking, though it had never been his primary specialty, and the forest provided a different set of challenges than the urban environments where he had spent most of his career. They found the compound on the third day, hidden in a valley that didn't appear on any commercial map. It was sophisticated, far more than the rustic retreat Sarah had expected, with multiple structures connected by covered walkways and surrounded by a security perimeter that rivaled military installations. She photographed everything she could without revealing her position, documenting the layout, the personnel movement patterns, the communication equipment that confirmed Chen's analysis. This was command and control, the nerve center of whatever remained of the Covenant's operational capability. The assault force arrived by helicopter 3 weeks later, descending on the compound in the pre-dawn darkness with overwhelming force. Sarah and Max were with the lead element, breaching the main building while explosions and gunfire echoed through the valley. The resistance was fierce but brief. The Covenant security forces were professionals, but they were outnumbered and outgunned, and within 20 minutes the compound had been secured. Sarah found the commander in a basement room, surrounded by servers and communication equipment. He was older than she expected, grey-haired and distinguished, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. When he saw her weapon aimed at his chest, he raised his hands slowly and smiled. "Lieutenant Collins," he said, "I've followed your career with great interest." "Captain," she corrected, "and you're under arrest." The commander's name was William Crane, and his capture represented the effective end of the Covenant as an operational organization. His testimony, extracted over months of interrogation, revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and identified the remaining members who had escaped previous operations. The trial made headlines for weeks, a spectacle of evidence and accusation that exposed the Covenant's ideology and methods to public scrutiny. Crane was convicted on multiple counts of terrorism and conspiracy, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security facility where his influence would finally be contained. Sarah watched the verdict from the back of the courtroom, Max resting at her feet. She felt no satisfaction in Crane's conviction, only the exhausted relief of a soldier who had survived a long campaign and lived to see its end. That evening, she drove Max to the park where everything had begun, where his instincts had first detected the threat that would define both their careers, The statue of the Olympic rings gleamed in the fading light, and families strolled through the space that had so nearly become a mass grave. Max sniffed the air, his nose cataloguing the ordinary scents of an ordinary evening. No explosives, no threats, no hidden dangers waiting to emerge. Just people enjoying the peace that he had helped to secure. Sarah knelt beside him, running her hands through his fur, feeling the familiar warmth of his body against her palms. "You did it, buddy," she said softly. "You saved them all." Max turned his head and licked her face, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes bright with the joy that defined his character. He didn't understand the significance of what they had accomplished, didn't comprehend the scope of the tragedy they had prevented. He only knew that his partner was happy, and that was enough. They sat together as the sun set over Atlanta, watching the city lights begin to twinkle against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new opportunities to serve. But tonight, for this perfect moment, they had won. The story of Sarah Collins and Max would become legend within the law enforcement community, taught at academies across the country as an example of instinct, courage, and the unbreakable bond between handler and K-9. But the woman and her dog who lived that story never sought recognition. They only sought to serve. And in the end, that was what made them heroes. 2 years later, Max retired from active duty in a ceremony attended by officers from across the southeast. He was 10 years old, his muzzle almost entirely grey, his movements slower, but his spirit undiminished. Sarah accepted his ceremonial retirement badge with tears she didn't bother to hide. He continued to live with her, of course. There was never any question about that. Their partnership had transcended the professional relationship that brought them together, becoming something deeper, something that defied easy categorization. He was her partner, her friend, her family. And every evening when the day's work was done and the city lights reflected off her apartment windows, she would sit with him and remember everything they had been through together, the chase through the park, the explosion of camera flashes, the terrified face of a man who had planned to kill thousands, the hunt for the Covenant, and the final victory that had brought peace to a city that had been unknowingly threatened. All of it, every moment, every challenge, every triumph, had been shared with the Belgian Malinois, who now lay at her feet, his breath slow and steady, his eyes still bright with the intelligence that had made him extraordinary. "Good boy," she would whisper, as she had 1,000 times before. "You're such a good boy." And Max, content in a way that only those who have truly served can understand, would rest his head on her foot and drift into the peaceful sleep of the righteous. The city spread out beyond the windows, its millions of inhabitants living their lives without knowing how close they had come to disaster. They would never know the full story, never understand the sacrifices that had been made on their behalf. But Sarah knew, Max knew, and that was enough. The end of one story is always the beginning of another. Sarah was promoted to major a year after Max's retirement, placed in command of all K-9 operations for the Atlanta Police Department. In that role, she trained the next generation of handlers and dogs, passing on the lessons she had learned through years of service. She taught them about instinct, about trust, about the bond that forms between human and K-9 when they face danger together. She showed them what it meant to follow a dog's lead, to believe in something they couldn't see or smell, to trust the nose that never lied. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons when training was finished and the facility was empty, she would bring Max to the field where the K-9s worked. He couldn't run anymore, his arthritis too advanced for that. But he could watch, he could remember. The young dogs would approach him with the deference that his age and experience commanded, sniffing his greying muzzle, sensing somehow the greatness that he represented. Max tolerated their attention with dignity, occasionally offering a gentle wag of his tail to acknowledge their respect. "He's a legend," One of the young handlers said, watching the interaction, "Every dog in this program carries his genetics. His bloodline is the foundation of everything we've built." Sarah nodded, pride swelling in her chest. "He's more than a legend," she replied. "He's the standard." The sun set over the training facility, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Sarah of the afternoon she had first been assigned to Max, almost 12 years ago now. She had been a young lieutenant then, ambitious but untested, with no idea of the journey that lay ahead. Max had taught her everything: patience, courage, trust, and the profound responsibility that comes with partnership. He had made her a better officer, a better leader, and a better person. Now, as she watched him rest in the fading light, she understood that the greatest gift he had given her was not the arrests or the lives saved or the commendations that filled her office walls. It was the privilege of loving something so completely and being loved just as completely in return. "Come on, buddy," she said softly, helping him to his feet. "Let's go home." Max rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement, but his tail wagged with the same enthusiasm it always had. Together, as they had done countless times before, they walked toward the car that would carry them home. The lights of Atlanta glittered in the distance, a city at peace, protected by the sacrifices of those who served without recognition or expectation of reward. And somewhere in that city, in the quiet moments between one crisis and the next, the story of a dog who saw what others missed continued to inspire those who heard it. The story of K-9 Max, the story of a hero. Years later, when Sarah was asked what she remembered most about that day in the park, she never talked about the terror or the chaos or the weight of the explosive vest that Max had revealed to the world. She talked about his eyes. The way he had looked at her in the moment before he broke free, that instant of silent communication that had passed between them faster than thought. He had known what he needed to do, and he had asked her, in that look, to trust him. She had hesitated. Just for a heartbeat she had tried to hold him back, to follow protocol, to do what she had been trained to do. And in that hesitation she had almost failed. But Max hadn't hesitated. He had trusted his instincts completely, absolutely without reservation, and that trust had saved more lives than anyone could count. That was the lesson she passed on to every handler who came through her program. Trust your dog, even when everything else tells you to hold back, even when protocol demands caution, even when the rational part of your brain screams that it's impossible. Trust your dog, because dogs don't lie. Dogs don't second-guess themselves. Dogs don't worry about careers or consequences or the opinions of supervisors. They sense the truth and they act on it. That's what makes them heroes. The memorial statue was unveiled on the 5th anniversary of the park incident, a life-sized bronze sculpture of Max in mid-leap, his body stretched toward an invisible threat, his eyes fixed with the intensity that had defined his service. It stood at the entrance to the K-9 training facility, a daily reminder to everyone who passed it of what a dog could accomplish when given the chance. Sarah attended the dedication ceremony, standing at attention while dignitaries gave speeches and cameras flashed, and the crowd applauded the symbol of heroism that the statue represented. Max was too frail to attend, his health declining in the way that all dogs eventually decline, but she knew that if he could have been there, he would have been bored by the ceremony and eager to go home. That was another thing she loved about him. He had never cared about recognition or praise. He had only cared about the work. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Sarah lingered by the statue, studying the bronze features that the sculptor had captured with remarkable accuracy. The set of his ears, the angle of his muzzle, the explosive power contained in his muscles. It was Max, frozen forever in the moment of his greatest triumph. "You deserved better," she murmured, reaching out to touch the cold metal. "You deserved a world without monsters." But the world did have monsters. It always would, and as long as monsters existed, there would need to be those willing to face them. Officers like Sarah, dogs like Max, partners who trusted each other enough to run toward danger when everyone else was running away. The sun was setting as she walked to her car, casting long shadows across the parking lot. In a few hours, Max would need his evening medication and his careful dinner of specialized food that his aging digestive system could handle. In a few days, she would need to make decisions that she had been putting off, decisions about quality of life and mercy and the terrible responsibility of loving something mortal. But not yet, not tonight. Tonight, she would go home to her partner, her friend, her hero. She would sit with him on the couch and tell him stories he couldn't understand, stories about the lives they had saved and the difference they had made. She would scratch behind his ears and feel his tail thump against the cushions and remember every moment of the journey they had shared. And when sleep finally came for both of them, it would be the peaceful sleep of warriors who had fought the good fight and won. The city of Atlanta slept beneath them, 3 million people safe in their beds, unaware of how close they had come to catastrophe. The covenant was broken, the terror was ended, the future was secure, all because one dog had seen what others had missed, all because one handler had trusted him enough to let him run. That was the story they would tell, long after both of them were gone. The story of a sunny morning and a charity event and a camera that captured something no one expected. The story of instinct and courage and the unbreakable bond between human and K-9. The story of K-9 Max and Lieutenant Sarah Collins. The story of heroes who had saved their city and asked for nothing in return. The end.